Hey guys. All right, so it's Monday. I'm recording this for Tuesday's class. I'm not there. I've got some notes, and so if I'm looking off screen, it's because I'm looking at these, and I'm trying to make this make sense without being in front of you guys. And so I'm gonna take this slow-ish. We are working through Kierkegaard and the ethical stage of existence. So here's where we left off yesterday. Kierkegaard says there's an aesthetic stage of existence, and that aesthetic stage is all about sort of self-indulgence. It comes with those 6 characteristics that we talked about: immersion in the sensuous experience, valorization of possibility over actuality, egotism, fragmentation of the subject of the experience, the nihilistic wielding of irony and skepticism, and a flight from boredom. Basically, we want to make everything out into entertainment in this stage of existence. And anything that we don't necessarily agree with, we sort of dismiss as stupid and archaic, and we just, whatever, who cares, right? And we make fun of it in a way to turn it into something humorous so that we don't have to deal with its reality. And that stark reality of it is the thing we're really trying to avoid. As we shift out of that and we lose the hyper saturation of the self and being satisfied only to be pleased and entertained, and we start to recognize the world outside of us, and we consider customary mores, rights and wrongs according to a given society, the way we greet people, and what's sort of appropriate and proper, and how we show respect, and this kind of thing, we find ourselves seriously considering the necessity to choose our course of actions seriously and inwardly. The belief that good and evil have truth value, that something that's bad is actually bad. It's not just like, oh, well, that's inconvenient. The belief that choice in our action is necessary. We have to make choices, and we have to make good choices, but regardless of whether or not we make good choices, we have to acknowledge the fact that we make choices. And choosing requires some act of the will. And then our choosing of ethical things happens in accordance with the rules. This is kind of a universal to moral agents. Kierkegaard argues, and this is what we didn't get to cover yesterday, Kierkegaard argues that the choice of right and wrong and the necessity to choose right and wrong in accordance with some set of rules is universal to anything that has a moral and ethical capability. Those rules aren't arbitrary, but they are transcendent. And so humans have this ability to evaluate a situation and to come to some principle of right and wrong, and then articulate that this principle of right or wrong is in fact what it is, and it is this way or that way because of some transcendent idea, something, some idea, some concept, something that's beyond just the practicalities of this particular situation. So a lion that hunts a gazelle, there's not a moral judgment in there. There's a practical consideration. The lion needs to eat. That animal happens to be food, if it can be caught. There is a moral consideration in human beings hunting and killing certain animals just for the sport. Then there is a moral consideration to be had. Is that good or not good? If we hunt and we make use of the animal that we've hunted, then maybe we can say, okay, sure, yeah, no problem. But if it's just for sport, then maybe there's a bigger problem to be had. Well, see, this is a moral consideration because there's now a principle here that's beyond just the practicality. And this is the point that Kierkegaard is trying to make. When we choose in accordance to rules, it's a universal thing that moral agents share. Whether it's us or it's God or it's angels, moral agents have this capacity to look and identify some transcendent principle or object of our decision-making process, and then choose in accordance with that transcendent reality. Actual ethics is a step away from the aesthetic and into something that acknowledges something beyond our own entertainment as the guiding source and principle for the way that we live our lives. And so those are the 4 conditions that have to be met in actual ethics. There are 5 conditions for ideal ethics, something he calls meta-ethics, like metaphysics. This is ethics for the metaphysical. He says good and evil depend on God, not social norms. So it's good to make good and evil judgments on the basis of social norms. That's a step beyond good and evil on the basis of my own selfish desires. But what's even better is understanding that good and evil depend on God's definitions of good and evil, not on social norms. Likewise, good and evil depend on God's definitions, not on my definitions. My definitions, aesthetic stage. Social norms, actual ethics. What's even better than that in the ethical is that good and evil depend on God's definitions. Second, he says this is essentially existential. We have to know, grow, and understand who God is and how God operates. And so we need an experience with God and continued ongoing relationship experiences with God in order to be able to rightly understand and discern what God says is good and what God says is not good. And so we're going to learn that by our experiences. As we do it and it falls apart, okay, so maybe that wasn't so good. Maybe I should try something different. I do it and it works out well. Okay, so maybe this is the good thing. Third, ideal ethics are always related to virtue. Not just some principle, not just some idea that's beyond the practicalities of a given situation, but real abiding virtue. Things like faith, hope, and love. Things like justice, fortitude, temperance, and prudence. And he says here, ideal ethics are always oriented toward these transcendent qualities that make humanity its greatest. So 1, good and evil depend on God's definitions, not on our own. 2, it's essentially existential. It's something we have to experience and grow into. It's something we learn by experience. 3, it's always related to virtue. 4, ideal ethics are always obedient. Obedient to God's definitions and understandings of what is good and evil, of what is right and what is wrong. Now that he says, whether begrudging or willful, doesn't matter, it's obedient. So God may want me to do something specific in a given situation, and I may not be a fan of doing that particular thing, but if I surrender and yield my will and do it anyway, I'm still doing the good thing. Now, I could do it better because my heart could be more involved in it, but I'm still doing the good thing. I'm still being obedient. I'm still surrendering that ego for something that's beyond. 5, ideal ethics begins with faith in God. If you don't have faith, then you won't ever understand God's definitions of good and evil. You'll never learn from the experiences according to the way God needs you to learn from those experiences, and they'll never be related to anything close to virtue because you won't care about the virtues in the first place. And if you don't have faith, then you won't be obedient. Ideal ethics begins with faith, acknowledging God, is obedient to God and his definitions of good and evil. It's related to our virtue and our character development, and essentially grows out of our life experiences. We have to cultivate faith, hope, love, patience, and devotion. But we need to be vigilant about our capacity to deceive ourselves. And so along the way, we have to be cultivating faith in the transcendent, eternal, and omnipresent God. These are the words of Kierkegaard. We have to navigate this world we live in with an eye on the God who created it the way it was intended to be. Understanding that the world is currently not what it is. Well, if that's the case, then this gets us into the religious stage of existence. And this really is where Kierkegaard makes his point pretty clearly. First, there are stages of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic stage is all about gratifying ourself. The ethical stage is about learning to do what is right, figuring out good and evil, right and wrong, and then trying to live according to that in some capacity. The religious is about faith. He says here, and this is the core to this religious stage of existence. And so you need to get this tagline: the lived faith is our selfhood. The lived faith is our selfhood. We are our choice or our habit of faith. We are our choice or habit of faith. He believes the repetition of faith is core to who we are. He says the repetition of faith is the self. Human beings, for Kierkegaard, are believing and doing things. Descartes says human beings are thinking things. Kierkegaard says human beings are believing and doing things. Our own repetition of faith is the way we relate to the God who constituted who and what we are. So on one side, we have the choice, and on the other side, we have the grandeur of making the choice. He puts it this way. He says, on one side, we dread the burden of choosing for eternity. This idea of faith in choosing God for eternity. On the other side is the exhilaration of freedom in choosing one's self, or the illusion of freedom in choosing oneself. Choice occurs in the instant where eternity and time intersect. As individuals, we create those moments of choice when we choose to do or not, to do good or to do evil, when we choose faith or we choose our own definitions, when we choose to be aesthetic or ethical, or when we choose to be rightly related in the religious stage of existence. We choose. And in those moments, he says, what's happening at those moments of choice in our life is time and eternity are intersecting with one another. And we can choose what is eternal and abiding and belongs to God, or we can choose what is selfish and belongs to the aesthetic. One of the two is a choice of faith and is most characteristic of who we really are. But we make those choices. And at the end of the time we've spent here on earth, the sum of our choices is reflective of who we are. Did we really have faith? Let's go look at all your choices. He says, Christian teaching, Christian dogma embodies paradoxes that are often offensive to reason. There are two possible attitudes that we adopt to these assertions that things aren't the way that reason tells us that they are, this paradox. There are two possible attitudes we adopt toward it. We can either choose to believe by the virtue of reason, or we can choose to trust and understand God's definitions, even if it sounds rather absurd. Here, Kierkegaard gets to his sort of high point, And he says the pinnacle of ethical behavior and the pinnacle of the life lived on this side of eternity with the life of faith, critical to all of that is Genesis 22. Genesis 22 is a story where God asks Abraham to take Isaac up the mountain and offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And Kierkegaard makes this argument. If our faith lived out is our self, it's who we really are. If we are the sum total of our choices for what God has said is good and right and holy and just and true, then anything that puts an ethical situation in front of us isn't just about ethics. It's about whether or not we will choose God's definitions, God's ways, and God's understandings, or we will assert our own. It is, in fact, a kind of tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we have a choice of choosing to say, nope, I won't take from the tree for myself. I choose what God has laid out for me, or I'll take the fruit and I'll eat and I'll decide for myself if this is good or bad. And in each of those moments along the journey, what we're faced with is the bell. What we're faced with is the choice of faith. The choice of faith and having faith in the God who knows and loves and redeems. And here he says, okay, so Genesis 22 now comes into play. He says this, Genesis 22, God says to Abraham, go sacrifice your son. We know God does not want child sacrifice because God says that he doesn't want child sacrifice. And Abraham doesn't argue with God. He just says, okay. And on their way up the mountain, Isaac asks him, and Abraham says, God will provide the lamb. Don't worry about it. But he's following through with the instructions God's given him. He's being obedient. He's begun with faith. He's understanding God's definitions. He's relying on God to do his thing, and he's being obedient to what God has asked him to do. He's living in ideal ethics. He's practicing the virtue of what it's supposed to look like. God is ultimately rational. He's going to make sense, even if it doesn't make sense to us. Jesus telling us to carry our cross and that to lose our life is to gain it. It's paradoxical and it doesn't make sense. But in the religious stage of existence, we trust what God has to say and we operate on that basis and we let the rest of it sort itself out. So Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain. And at the end of the encounter, he gets Isaac back. Just like if we lay down our life and surrender our choices in faith, at the end of the day, we get it back. God is rational. God may not always make sense to us because God's reason is God's reason, not necessarily ours. And so what Kierkegaard says is there's a way that life makes sense that doesn't accord itself to human reason. It accords itself to God's definitions, to God's understanding, and to God's reason. My ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. God's wisdom is foolishness to those who are perishing. The wisdom of God is grand and mysterious, and nobody knows it except the Spirit. This is something that Kierkegaard has tapped into, and he's understanding this. And so what we're faced with daily is a choice. Will we live and acknowledge God, his definitions and his ways and his manner of doing things, or will we do it our own way? Abraham is the example. Abraham's not just the example of how we do it the right way and live sort of ethically. Abraham's the example of how we live in faith. Because living in faith for Kierkegaard isn't about believing God and then walking away and doing our own thing. Living in faith for Kierkegaard is about understanding what God has asked of us, acting in accordance with what God has asked of us, and trusting God to take care of everything else. And when we do that, Kierkegaard says we are most perfectly human. And we find God at work redeeming the creatures we've become to make us who we ought to be. Okay. We'll pick up there on Wednesday.